Hello and welcome to our very first episode of Conversations with the Calico Club, House and Garden's new online talk series. My name is Emily Tobin, I'm Creative Director of the Calico Club, and every Wednesday at 6 p.m. British Summer Time, I will rally some of the most talented creatives in their field to talk about interiors, gardens, design, food, art, and everything in between. I hope this will be an opportunity for you to learn new skills, to hone your eye, for some good old-fashioned escapism, and for us to bring the pages of the magazine to life. We are running these sessions live, so please do bear with us if there are any technical hitches along the way. Hello, first up we have Gabby Deeming, whose name readers of the magazine will know well. Gabby has been at House and Garden for 16 years, and she is responsible for creating the incredibly beautiful room sets we feature on our decoration pages. And she has an encyclopedic knowledge of every ticking and twirl under the sun, which makes her very well placed to lead our first discussion, The Power of Print, 5 Fabrics that Change the Way We Decorate. I will hand over to you, Gabby.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, I hope you can all hear me. So today I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite subjects, which is printed textiles. And I'm assuming because you're all here watching that perhaps they're one of your favourite things as well, or maybe just textiles in general. I think printed textiles are very powerful. I mean, they don't win wars, but I think they cheer us up immensely. I think there's an enormous nostalgia attached to them. I think of prints I had in my bedroom when I was little. I think about the prints I wear every day. I mean, even actually just looking at myself now, I'm surrounded by them. I've got my block printed curtains. I'm wearing an old Laura Ashley printed dress, and there's some more block print over there. So I'm rarely not, oh, and there's even more here. You lived a bit of Brunswick and Fees down here too. So yeah, I take great comfort in being surrounded by them. And I think a lot of power comes from that. And I think when I was choosing my 5 fabrics that I feel have contributed a huge amount and shaped the way we decorate, certainly a couple of them played into that nostalgic feeling. So yeah, so anyway, I'll get straight to it. So my first fabric is probably the earliest, well, it is the earliest form of printing. They're the Indian block prints from the Coromandel coast. So lots of you will be familiar with this sort of look, but I'll describe them. Oh, here we are, there's a PDF there for you to see. So these are the very, very first prints. Before anyone else was printing, in the East, they were block printing and also using a process called kalamkari, which was painting directly onto the fabric using a pen. The Indians were incredibly skilled, much more skilled than anyone else. And we weren't printing in Europe at all at this time. So the work that they managed to produce just using hand-carved wooden and metal blocks and these reed pens full of pigment is quite extraordinary. The detail they achieved. And you can see they were used on dresses, we used them in decoration. They were unlike anything we'd seen on this continent before. We weren't producing cotton, we weren't weaving cotton. They were light and pretty, you could wash them. So once the French East India Company started importing these fabrics into France via the port of Marseille, everybody went completely wild for them. Very, very wealthy women wanted to wear them. The women in the court of Versailles, spearheaded by, I think, Madame de Pompadour, Louis XV's mistress, they were delighted with these beautiful new textiles from India, even though lots of people thought they should be the clothes of the poor because they were just made out of a humble printed cotton. But the Indians had really nailed the process. They developed mordants, which meant the colours were fixed. So as these prints gained huge amounts of popularity in France and in England as well, and also in Holland, the French wanted to start printing their own. They could see there was this demand. So quite quickly, the French government put a ban on importing these textiles at all because it was competing with the silk and wool industries. So if you were caught smuggling these cloths into the country, you could be hung or perhaps guillotined, I don't know, but either way you were dead meat. And if you were caught wearing a dress in the street, apparently it could be ripped from your back. This might just be rumours, but I think I like the controversy and the drama that surrounds this incredibly pretty, quite sort of feminine print. Who'd have thought it could be such a kind of source of political contention? Anyway, eventually these beautiful prints could be produced in France, and they couldn't staunch the demand for them. So once the French became better at it, it became a huge industry, or what we think of as toiles now, toile de Juillet industry. So Madame de Pompadour, she loved them. She decorated her apartments in Versailles with them and wore them, and it just spread from there. So there's a very, very famous print by a print house that sprung up in France as a result of this demand, called Bracanier, who are now part of the Pierre Frey group. And they've got an extraordinary archive, or Pierre Frey have the most extraordinary archive, which I've been very lucky to have a rummage through in Paris. And this print by Bracanier, which you can see throughout these images on the slide, is called Le Grand Genois, and it's this huge tree of life, which is a direct 18th century copy, French copy of an Indian print. And you can see it used in the bed at the bottom. That is a museum in Marseille called, is it Musée de Bourse or Musée, what's it called? Château Borelli. Which is now the Marseille Museum of Decorative Art. So Pierre Frey oversaw the renovation of that museum. And then you can also see in the bedroom on the far right, that's a very recent iteration of the fabric used again in a French house belonging to an American businessman called Chris Birch. But wherever you use this fabric, it's extraordinarily pretty and powerful. And I'm not sure it's ever really been out of demand or unloved since it was first produced at this time. I think in terms of what it sort of brings to a room, I think maybe it's the production methods, the block printing, and even when it was the Bracanier one, I assume might be block printed. I'm pretty certain it's screen printed now. It would be very difficult to block print something like that. The history of the designs bring a huge amount to a room. If you're decorating now, if you put this fabric up on the walls, you know, the work is really done. I mean, I don't think you need anything else. The room will feel established and beautiful. And also these early Indian designs, which were where all the patterns came from Mughal flowers and trees and birds, were much lighter in touch than a lot of the later fabrics that then came about, which we're going to come to next. If you want to look at some other companies doing similar things to the Bracanier prints and other textiles inspired by the 18th century Indian designs, you could have a look at Nicole Fabre. She's got an extraordinary archive of French designs from that period. Obviously, Bracanier are amazing, and their sister company, Le Manac, have extraordinary things. Pucker Print do beautiful block printing in Jaipur. It's really worth looking at their things. Name Samin, also Les Indiennes. So after this sort of beautiful lightness of touch, once we were capable of printing our own fabrics, and also we were, as the Industrial Revolution moved on, we were also weaving our own cotton. So none of the work was going to India anymore. We'd brought it all here. In France, they'd sort of adopted some of the Indian designs. But in the UK, our own cotton industry and our print industry, we were developing a design which we now call chintz, even though the early Indian designs are actually the real chintzes. So basically we moved away from the Mughal designs. We had this homegrown industry, and we were producing quite sort of English designs, or what we think of now as quite English designs, cascading ribbons, ivy, little charming bouquets of posies, and this is very much what we call chintz, and it had a chintzy finish. So the Victorians, it was an immensely practical choice for a room. Rooms are probably, I don't know, I'm just thinking of dusty industrial rooms, so women could just like give the chair covers a bit of a shake, which would have been a huge change from the kind of heavy velvet brocades and silks that would have been covering everything before, and would have needed a good old beating with a brush to get them clean. So basically, so chintz became huge, and it couldn't be printed fast enough. We were block printing very beautiful pieces, as well as roller printing the mass-produced stuff, which was much, much cheaper. So we were churning out the chintz for the Victorians. They were going absolutely mental for it, filling their houses in a way that nowadays we would find really quite full on, and you know, we wouldn't really want to live like that. It would have been very heavy when you think of their their sort of, the dim lighting and the dark furniture, it would have been quite an oppressive look. Even the very prettiest chintzes, I think, might have been a bit heavy going, unless you were lucky enough to have beautiful, huge windows and an amazing daylight. So the chintz look, after its sort of heyday in the Victorian times, sort of fell out of fashion in the early 20th century as people wanted neo-Georgian, and that then turned into Art Deco. People wanted something cleaner and simpler and something that just felt much more modern and young and forward-thinking. So chintz kind of, it kind of fell by the wayside a bit before it had a huge resurgence and started being used in a way much more as we use it today, in a way we're really familiar with. And that was thanks to the decorating firm Colfax and Fowler, which you've probably worked out by looking at the slide, where you can see their very, very famous chintz print, Bowood. It was first produced as a textile by Colfax in the 60s, but John Fowler had found the textile the decade before in the 50s at Bowood House. And he saw it and thought it was, obviously thought it was a brilliant design. And it is an incredibly beautifully pretty design. It has that lightness of touch. It's not too heavy. And you can see how well it works in a room. If you Google it and look online, you'll see it used in the most extraordinary rooms. People go nuts for it. They put it on everything, walls, ceilings, chairs. There doesn't seem to be any surface that Bowood doesn't have a right to smother. So in the top picture, that's just a loose cover I made for a sofa, an old Chesterfield Victorian sofa. So it's the only pattern in the room really, and it looks very pretty. It doesn't feel overwhelming at all. Bottom left, that's a bedroom in Bowood House. So I'm not sure if that's the original Bowood on the walls or whether it's been recovered since, but that's in one of the original pink and green colours. The grey and green that you can see in most of the images, that was the colour that John Fowler developed. That was the first colour that was produced in the 60s that you can still get today, although there are some other colours available as well. So anyway, that was, so the way Colfax and Fowler were decorating was really how we still use chintz now, I think. And I spoke to Lucy Hammond-Giles, one of the decorators from Colfax, about chintz because she uses it so beautifully. In fact, all the decorators at Colfax use it very beautifully, not just the Colfax chintzes, but chintzes from all sorts of people. But Lucy says of Bowood, she said, as the brilliant Colfax Bowood reliably illustrates, much like a toile, chintz can be used exclusively and over literally everything: walls, curtains, bed hangings, and in the case of Roger Banks' pie, it can even go on the floors. She loves how it can also be made into a graphic thing. It doesn't have to be sort of blousy and floral and overwhelming. You can mix it with a bold check or stripe for a completely different look, or you can use it to create an interior that feels very established and evolved by mixing it with antiques and paintings and tapestries and other fabrics. It's a very accommodating fabric, I think, chintz. I think maybe a lot of our associations with it are of interiors that are quite kind of comfortable and evolved and maybe a bit eclectic. It doesn't have to be that very firm decorated look. I think of kind of floppy, I think of sort of loose covers on English sofas in the summertime and that kind of thing. That for me is the sort of the ultimate chintz. Slightly dusty, perhaps a sort of afternoon nap and some rays of light coming through the curtains. I think of things like a room with a view and and that sort of thing. But if you want to find some beautiful chintzes now, as well as Colfax, you can look at Lee Jofer, Jean Monroe and Hazelton House for extraordinary hand block printed chintzes. Incredibly beautiful. Christopher Moore's got some lovely ones, and Florent Delaine at Tissu Delaine's got some lovely things as well. So then my third fabric, again, it was running around the same time as the Victorian chintz, and actually as a kind of reaction to the chintz, William Morris came along. I think he must have been quite revolted by it. He built a house and then designed everything to go in the house, from sort of the carpets and tapestries to the fabrics and the wall coverings. I imagine not a drip of chintz touched any of his interiors. Although actually, even after he established his own printing works and was producing lots and lots of his own designs of fabric, I spoke to Ben Pentreath about William Morris recently, because I know, again, he likes to use William Morris in his own projects, which actually you can see images of on the slide. Ben was saying that apparently, I think almost half or 2/3 of what Morris & Co were producing were actually chintzes for the Victorian market. Sadly, I think his own designs were quite prohibitively expensive, and not many people could afford them, but they all wanted chintz. So I guess that's what kept him in business, which is kind of ironic. Anyway, so we can see one of the interesting things about Morris as well is that this is the first time a designer had really become famous in his own right as a name. Many of us can recognise the iconic William Morris designs now, and we'll say that they're William Morris and we know his name. Unless you're a sort of quite a major textile boffin, you probably haven't heard of some of the more obscure designers of chintzes or toile de juiz. They were created by usually jobbing artists who sold designs directly to the printers, or maybe they worked for one of the printers. And but yes, William Morris really was sort of, this is where sort of when sort of designers as sort of famous names and celebrities, I suppose, began to take hold. I think there's a huge nostalgia for William Morris. I think of it as I think about friends' houses growing up in the sort of late 70s and 80s. We didn't actually have very much at home, but we had a friend who had blackthorn, which is the design you can see in the picture here, in their downstairs loo, and they had an avocado basin and loo, and I thought this room was very exotic. I used to love the way and I still do love the way the little white flowers peep out of that dark background, much like it makes you think of the little flowers in the bottom of Botticelli's Primavera, those gorgeous, sort of lovely little meadow. William Morris's influence over design in general has been extraordinary. Many designers, fashion and interiors, have taken on his look and expanded it. They've played with the scale of his designs and recolored them, and every iteration sort of carries his story further and further into new realms, which is brilliant. It's exactly what these designs should be doing. Even with the Indian fabrics, again, we often see those reinvented in different colours and seeing them not in the original vegetable dyes. The life that a lot of these fabrics take on after their original iterations is really exciting. So yes, it's wonderful to see where William Morris has travelled since he first started producing his own designs. And I love how Ben has decorated this kitchen in Highgate, which he says is almost a direct copy of a kitchen of a friend of his, her father's kitchen in Hampstead in the 60s. It feels really... What's interesting about William Morris, I think, and again, actually, it's another point Ben makes, is unlike chintz, it's quite hard to mix things with William Morris. His fabrics are quite uncompromising. And I guess that's partly because he designed it as such a complete look for his own house. There aren't many other sort of floral patterns you can mix with it. You could use smaller Morris prints, or you could use simple stripes, but actually they work very well here. Just mixing them with other materials, the woods, the ceramic, and those solid colours on the oven and on the cupboard doors and on the painted chair at the bottom. But yes, it's a much more, maybe that's something to do with the artist, I don't know, but they're not as generous spirited perhaps as the chintzes, and in fact as our next guy who we're going to come to, who I think might be a personal favourite. So number 4 is we're heading north now to 1930s Sweden and the work of the Austrian architect Joseph Frank. Very, very different look to William Morris, and of course he was designing a bit later. He was born in Austria and raised in Austria, but as a Jew, he and his wife Anna moved to Sweden in the 1930s to escape the Nazis. And it was here that he formed a relationship with the founder of Svensk 10, Estrid Eriksson, and they had a real shared vision of what they thought design should be. They had a shared idea of it being a very human thing, a very a sort of happy and free. And it was quite interesting. What I think is so lovely about what Joseph Frank was doing is he didn't want houses to be fixed. He thought they should be constantly evolving, and he thought they should just be full of the things that you like, that you love. And if you like the things in your house, if you love them, then everything will be okay. You just have to keep going. He said it's a job that's never, it's never finished. You just have to keep putting in what you love. And he designed these extraordinarily joyful textiles. The one in the picture is called Tulipa, but he did so many others, very organic, whimsical, quite wild, imaginative prints. The curator of the Millsgarden Museum in Stockholm, which holds a huge amount of the Frank archive, said of Joseph Frank that he brought something to Sweden that before we didn't have. She said, his work makes you happy. And I think that's just an incredibly, there's just such a truth to that. His fabrics are so joyful, and there's something very deeply moving and human about his own sort of manifesto, how he says, the house is not a work of art, it's just a place where one lives. His look felt so modern and exciting at that time. And if you think in England, we were sort of getting quite gloomy. I don't want to knock people like Lucian Day because their work's really relevant, but I find that kind of post-war sort of British textile thing quite sort of gloomy. And I think when you look at what Joseph Frank was doing, it was just so magical somehow. And unlike Morris, again, you can really sort of throw his look together with all sorts of other fabrics and furniture, which he did. He designed an enormous, he left something like 1,300 furniture designs and 200 fabric designs behind him after he died in his archive. And when you visit the Svensk shop and you see all his work together combined, and often they work with other artists and they bring other things in, it all just works. So it's this sort of lovely, harmonious, sort of colourful, joyful chaos. It's a really beautiful look, and there's something generous about it, which in a way you don't get so much with William Morris, where it's a little bit more fixed. You've got to kind of, I feel like with Morris, he's sort of asking you to stick to the rules a bit, whereas Joseph Frank wants you to chuck them out of the window. And also when you think he was operating at the same time as somebody like Le Corbusier, whose work was incredibly popular then, he's also doing the opposite of Le Corbusier, who is, I don't know whether to say he's joyless, because he obviously had his moments, but I think that compared to somebody like Frank, who just wanted us all to be free, there's no comparison. And I was talking to Beata Heyman, the designer, whose work I'm sure, again, a lot of you know, and she works with Joseph Frank a lot, and obviously Beata's Swedish too. And when I asked her about him and why she likes decorating with him, she'd actually just finished reading a book on Frank, so she was really full of love for him. And she says that when she looks at Frank's fabric designs, she feels like his talent and free-thinking imagination literally blooms before her eyes. She said she thinks his fabric designs are the truest representation of what he believed humans need to be happy: the connection to nature and randomness, the mystery and elements of the past. Apparently his fabrics were actually very inspired by William Morris, which is so interesting. And also, obviously he had this jaw-dropping artistic skill. So in the image we can see, in the images on the slide, in the bottom middle image, that's he was an architect. So this is a villa he designed called Villa Carlson in Sweden, and you can see the tulip fabric hanging in the background in the 1930s. That's one of his sofas designs on the left, which I'm sure many of us would be delighted to have in our houses now. I mean, it really hasn't dated at all. In fact, nothing about Svensk 10 and what Joseph Frank did there has dated. If you go to the shop in Stockholm and compare it to photographs of the shop, which are in black and white from the 50s and 60s, you can see it's exactly, the style's exactly the same. It's just so, it feels so fresh and contemporary. It's an absolutely brilliant look. And his work, again, much like Morris's, just goes carrying on. It continues to be enormously influential. So many fabrics we see, you can trace their DNA back to Joseph Frank's botanical drawings and the way he expressed his pattern repeats through print. I think his journey still has a very, very long way to go. So staying in Scandinavia, this brings us to fabric number 5, our last one. It was quite tricky to come in at number 5. I did toy with something more abstract because at this point, a lot of artists were getting involved. People like Sonia Delaunay and Annie Albers and Raoul Dufy had been designing textiles. They were all so beautiful. There was this big artistic movement. But I'm just going to put Joseph Frank in that category and take this design by Marimekko into a kind of completely sort of separate realm, which is developing the floral into an abstract. So when I chose this, I realized it was yet another floral, and now this is 5 florals out of 5 fabrics that change the way we decorate, suggesting that I'd guess like no printed stripes or printed checks or printed abstracts have obviously made enough of an impact on me, at least. But this one is really interesting, whether you like it or not, or whether you'd use it in your own home. Without a doubt, I'm sure you all recognize it. It really is iconic. Designed in 1964 by Maya Isola. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, probably not. I did actually put into Google where you can hear it phonetically. Anyway, so that's what I've taken as mine. So sorry if there's anyone Finnish listening. So Maya Isola worked for the Finnish company Marimekko and was tasked by the founder of Marimekko, Arma Ratia, to design a range of prints. But she was strictly told not to design a floral. Arma Ratia didn't want to see any florals. She said they look nicer in nature and they've been done to death in textiles. Anyway, Maya Isola obviously sat down with her paintbrush and did the complete opposite. And she came up with this really interesting, very avant-garde, simple representation of a poppy in repeat, which had a kind of modern freshness and allowed this floral textile to be applied to interiors in a way that nothing really had before then, not in this way. It could be used with modern Swedish design. It could be the only pattern in a room. It could be the only textile in a room with sort of hard floors and hard furniture. It would look wonderful with Alvar Aalto designs, which I think you can see actually in that bottom image. I think that's one of Marimekko's press images, but you can sort of see that clean Scandinavian. And also this design has been huge in Japan, which you can sort of see for the same reasons. There's a very shared aesthetic between Scandinavia and Japan. So suddenly you've got this whole new look for a floral that isn't remotely romantic or drippy, like when you think about kind of the full-on chintzes or the kind of amazing intricacy of the hand block printing and hand painting of the Indiennes, or that the kind of that sort of mind-bending detail of William Morris and his incredibly detailed repeats that he was drawing. This is so free, it's so simple, it's just screen printed, which would have been, so quick to produce. And anyway, it sort of very quickly reached worldwide fame, and it had a huge moment in the 60s. And then this look came back again quite strongly in the 90s with, I think it's quite funny to think of that IKEA campaign. So IKEA was sort of really bringing that Scandinavian pared back look to the UK, and it looked kind of great with sort of mixed up with Coromandel sort of glass bricks and the warehouse conversions and stainless steel and all of that kind of stuff, with the bleached birch floors and the bare brick. And then suddenly you could use a pattern like this. And IKEA, who were producing some of their own textiles, had their motto, which was "chuck out your chintz." So yeah, that sort of feels like that kind of brings the whole thing quite nicely full circle to this very modern, clean interpretation of floral. So what I think is quite interesting about all 5 of these designs is that when they came along at their moment in time, nothing like them had gone before. They all marked a very directional shift in what decoration looked like before, and what it was then going to go on to look like afterwards. And the other thing, probably why I chose all these particular 5 fabrics, is because they're also all relevant now. They're all very contemporary designs. You could have one house that had all of these prints in it, and those 5 prints in one house would be telling a story of textile print that goes back 300 years and tells a really beautiful story. And that's it. That's the end of my 5 fabrics. Thanks very much. Back to Emily.
And thank you so much. That was so brilliant. Who knew there was such jeopardy attached to fabrics?
I know. Imagine death by gallows or guillotine, or having your beautiful Indian dress stripped from your back in the street. What a horror.
Amazing. And I also love the Joseph Frank sentiment that if you like everything in your house, everything will be okay, which I feel like will speak to everyone sitting at home at the moment.
Yeah, I think his story is particularly poignant because obviously he'd been exiled from his own homeland. He had no home of his own as such, and yet he'd come to Sweden and, you know, created this beautiful, generous manifesto for living and these gorgeous, generous prints that were making people happy and bringing colour to Sweden and Scandinavia. And yeah, there's something very poignant about that, I think.
Yeah. I think we have got time for a few questions, which some of you have brilliantly sent in over email and over Instagram. Catherine has emailed and said, what impact do you think the print process has on the product?
Huge impact. Huge. Yeah, I sort of get a bit of a bee in my bonnet about printing, actually. It's the difference between, it's interesting, you can take, when you draw a print onto a piece of paper, you can then choose how you apply it to fabric. You could hand paint it, you could screen print it, you could block print it, you could digitally print it. And each one will give you a very different feeling. Digital printing at its worst looks like you've photocopied it. There's a lot of very bad digital printing out there. And it isn't necessarily any cheaper than screen printing. And I find it quite depressing, I have to say, as a production. Screen printing, there's a real craft to screen printing. It shouldn't be dismissed as just mass production. A company like Fermoy, for example, who are a very new company, they screen print very carefully, very beautifully. They play a lot with pressure to create a look that feels delicate and hand created. And then, of course, there are people still block printing, like Pucker Print and Pucker Fabre and all sorts of people. Molly Mann obviously does a lot. In fact, Molly's very clever. She mixes digital and she does block. She does all of it to create this sort of very kind of this very complete look for her work. But I think the look you're going to get on a final product, depending on how you print it, is it's huge. It's everything, the printing.
Also, I have a secret sidebar that tells me that Molly Mann is watching, so she'll be thrilled about that shout out. And someone else on Instagram has asked, how do you incorporate multiple patterns without overdoing it?
Very difficult. It's personal taste. I mean, you could go down the Joseph Frank route and just say, I mean, as long as you like it and it makes you happy, don't sweat it, just keep going. I mean, it's tricky. There are kind of formulas for balancing pattern, but they can get quite staid quite quickly. Like there's you kind of, you have your kind of big figurative design and you mix it with a check and a stripe and then a smaller design. And that's quite a good kind of rule of thumb to start. But then you really want to make sure you have your rogue elements. You want to have something that's perhaps a bit surprising or a bit ugly. You just don't want it to get too matchy unless you really like that very kind of schemed look. I think just make sure you try and have a strong idea of what you like first. I think like work out what interiors you admire, and then I don't know, count the patterns in the room and do something similar. But yeah, it's hard to know when to stop. I think trust your instinct, but if you like it, chuck it in. The good thing about textiles is a lot of them are on things like cushions and small things that they can come in and go out.
Yeah.
So it's not like a tattoo.
And I wanted to ask, as we can all tell from your little floral nest that you're in at the moment, florals obviously hold a very warm place in your heart. But why do you think they've been such an enduring classic, and why have all these designers gone back to them again and again?
I think I think we have a very human relationship with nature, to nature. I think it's where, if you go back to the Indian designs, it's kind of gardens and flowers. I mean, that's sort of where that's sort of where, it's not like it was the only place for inspiration, but it's not like we had art galleries to go to like we do now. Like there were far fewer things around to kind of influence and get you mark making. You will find some very early interesting mark makings, which are just like squiggles and patterns and, the sort of thing we would all doodle in repeat. But I think the thing about florals, I think it just speaks to something in our human psyche. I think as these 5 fabrics demonstrate, florals can have such a different impact. They can look so different. They can, You know, they can be incredibly blousy and full on and little Bo Peep. They can be very pared back. They can be light and pretty. They can be barely there. But I think I think there's a very particular relationship between humans and plants and flowers, and I think textiles speak to that same part of. I think flowers on textiles speaks to that part of us that likes tactility and nature and feeling safe and comforted, and yeah.
Yeah, that makes good sense. Well, I think that's probably the right moment to give Gabby a huge, enormous thank you for taking us on a very vivid journey across the centuries. I hope it will all make you think a little bit differently about the pattern that you live with in your own homes. And I also want to say an enormous thank you to all of you for tuning in. We've had an incredible 954 people sign up to this talk, which is just wild and brilliant, and we are super grateful. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Next week I will be talking to our garden editor Claire Foster. We will be discussing how to create a successful cutting garden. It will be at Wednesday, 6 o'clock British summertime. You can register by going to calicoclub.co.uk. Also keep an eye on our Instagram, because that's when you'll hear what else is coming up in the calendar. If you can't watch live, do log in, do register anyway, because as with this talk, we'll send you a video recording a day or two later, so you'll still be able to watch it. So enormous thanks to everyone. It's a really glorious sunny day here in London, so I hope the sun is shining for you wherever you are. Take care, and I hope I will see you next time. Goodbye.